Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, presented by me, Suzi Fay. Today's book bag is a very new book bag. It doesn't actually have anything to do with the person that I am going to be talking to, but it is my very latest book bag. It comes from Penguin. Home is where the books live, and it's. I went to an event that was all about book talk, which I think, as I've explained in the past, nobody really knows what it is or how it works. People in publishing or people like me, but it's a fantastic thing. Everybody's looking into it. And this was a launch for YA novels that are presumably going to go on TikTok and sell an absolute fortune. Nothing to do with poetry and nothing to do with my next guest, who is a fantastic poet, a good friend, an old friend, and I'm delighted to be welcoming into the book bag John McCullough. Welcome, John.
Hello.
Hi there. Are you aware of Book Talk? Have you come across it?
I have heard it. It does, slightly fill me with terror and make me feel mildly cretaceous. But yeah, I can't say I have anything like your knowledge of it.
Yeah, I just know that it seems to work for certain books, but I don't think there's a poetry book talk. I was talking to Cara Hunter, the crime writer, and one of her books has just done really well on TikTok with sort of millions of views. But I think, I don't know, it doesn't seem to work for literary novels that I've heard, and I'm not sure it works for poetry. But there's such a thing as internet poetry, isn't there? Have you looked into that burgeoning area of the poetry world?
Do you mean Insta poetry, maybe? Instagram poetry?
Oh, maybe I mean that. Oh, yes, exactly. Maybe I mean that. Yeah, Instagram poetry. I'm so with it. It's incredible.
I only got on Instagram because so many of my undergraduates were doing their dissertations on Insta poetry. So that's what got me on there finally.
Right. Oh, so what's the scene like? What is there a great deal of content in Insta poetry?
It's kind of its own medium, really. I think that the fact that it has to catch someone who's scrolling through a feed means that Insta poetry has to be very immediate. It's not the place for subtlety and obliqueness. Has to really kind of like grab you straight away, and they often pair the poem with an image too. So yeah, it's very much a bit like the difference between spoken word and poetry written for the page, or more avant-garde stuff. There is it's kind of tailored to the place where the poem's going to appear.
Okay, well, let's go into your poetry, which doesn't need images to go with it. It's absolutely full of imagery, and is indeed subtle and oblique in many ways. So we met on a memorable night at the South Bank over a decade ago for this wonderful little book here, your debut poetry book. The Frost Fairs. What had you published before Frost Fairs came out? Because this is a prize winner, and this is how we met.
That was my first book. So I had a couple of little pamphlets of poetry published, but that was my first book. I think I did my PhD was published with an academic publisher, but that was my first kind of proper actual book that people could buy in a bookshop.
Yeah, published by Salt, lovely imprint, called The Frost Fairs. Doesn't actually have a poem called The Frost Fairs in it, but it does have a poem called The Other Side of Winter that begins, overnight the Thames begins to move again. The ice beneath the Frost Fair cracks, tents, merry-go-rounds and bookstalls glide about on islands given up for lost. So you didn't go down the route of pick a poem and make that your title. It's, again, oblique. Oblique is the word. What did the Frost Fairs mean?
For me, it's a long time since I wrote that book, but at the time I'd done some voluntary work as an archivist for a queer history archive locally called Brighton Our Story, and I'd been researching a lot of queer lives in the past, and my PhD was on that area too. That was a bit early, but Renaissance. But yeah, for my first collection, there's quite a lot of poems that investigate the past and the lives of queer people in 19th century or World War II, and a lot of that time's obviously marked by not acting on desire and by all these kinds of barriers to people achieving what they wanted. And so a lot of the poems in that first book are quite icy and about kind of I suppose the celebration that happens when those stolen moments arrive. It was really noticeable with the archive that even when there were these love letters between two men or two women, they would just be so reticent about so many things, and obviously there's a tiny fraction that would be bold enough to record anything on paper, because could have been potentially lethal for if it was discovered. And yeah, so I chose the title "The Frost Verse" partly because I was thinking about what grows in kind of cold places and absence, the moments of celebration and the intensity that's granted to them, like a fair. The kind of queer moments in those poems are kind of liminal spaces, I suppose. But yeah, that book was a long time ago.
It was, yes. But, at the same time, yes, something fragile, something that lasts a short time. You make the most of it when you can. Just unpacking the idea of frost fairs is... what you were saying about people being reticent. Poetry is all about reading between the lines as well, isn't it? And there being more to unpack and more underneath the surface. So it all works. Definitely, really well.
Yeah. In that first book, it relies quite a lot on silence and implication, like using silence to suggest things. And it's quite. There are celebratory poems within that book, but it is my early work is often quite cool, I think, and more detached than my more recent books. And that was a choice at the time because of the subject matter. But yeah, I really like the way that poetry, because with the kind of poetry I write for the page, I expect that the reader's going to read it more than once, and so you can be more subtle. You can pack in little enjambed meanings, little things beneath the surface that maybe someone will uncover more slowly, rather than with insta poetry where you have to grab the reader, straight away with something, or they'll just scroll past it in the feed.
So when did you, as a young lad, you grew up in Watford, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
You're now living on the south coast, but how and why did you first get the poetry bug? When did that happen?
For me, it happened as a teenager. I went to a really good school, and they had a brilliant English department with, the school itself wasn't great, but the English department was amazing. I had some wonderful English teachers who got me into Ted and Sylvia. So it really was through Plath and Hughes that I got switched on to poetry. So I had to do Sylvia Plath as an A-level text, and just her imagery really spoke to me. I was teaching for Arvin at Lumbank a couple of weeks ago, where Sylvia Plath was based, and it was such a thrill to see all the places where she had been and where Hughes had been, and they really switched me on to poetry that was quite image based and that was quite creative and surprising and dramatic. And yeah, that's how I first got into poetry, really, as a teenager.
Is there a particular Plath poem where you thought, wow, what this woman can do?
Oh, so many. I think I particularly like her more playful side. So I quite like things such as Mushrooms where the speaker's this collective. It's all about we do this and we do that. And I found that really inspiring. And I think pretty much the first poem I wrote was because I wanted to I knew I wanted to study creative writing at University of East Anglia as an undergraduate, and to get on the course, they only accepted like I think 12 students a year or something. To get on the course, you had to submit either some poems or some fiction, and one of the poems that I submitted to get on the course was similarly, it was a poem in a collective voice, and it was I'm sure entirely dreadful. Thankfully, I don't have access to this poem anymore. But yeah, it was narrated by a bacterium. I think this is what the sort of thing that I was writing as a teenager. And but yeah, it was definitely reading that kind of poetry that got me. I think as a teenager, I was, stereotypically angsty and lonely and feeling very isolated as a queer person growing up in a working class environment. I didn't fit in remotely where I grew up, not just because of being queer, but also just from really liking books. I went to a local comprehensive, amazing English department, but yeah, in trouble if you're seen reading a book on the school bus. I remember one time I had Ted Hughes's New and Selected Poems. I don't know if I've actually got it behind me somewhere. Yeah, here it is. Rather conveniently right there. But yeah, it has on its cover some foxgloves.
Is that the actual book?
This is the actual book that I had as a teenager. So it's, well thumbed. The spine is rather cracking. But yeah, someone saw me reading that book on the school bus, and yeah, I'd never heard the end of it because it had flowers on the cover. And I was just like, but Ted Hughes is this really macho poet, much more macho than me. But no, it had flowers on the cover. So terrible.
Yes. So that cut no ice at all on a bus in Watford, on a school bus. Yeah, so when did you first publish a poem then? Because I was talking to Claire Pollard, and she started really, really young. I mean, her first book was written when she was still at school, and she'd already published poems in magazines. So how did that work out for you? Did you get on the course, by the way? Did you get
I did, yeah. And I think that I had to write quite a lot of poems before I really kind of hit my stride. I think for me, I've been around for a while, and it took me quite a long time to get my first book. And it was, I think I started writing consistently from 1996 onwards. And I had some poems in the Rialto and Magma and things in about 2003. So I'd been writing for about 7 years or so. And but even then, it was not until 2011 that I did my first book, and it wasn't until Red Pepper Birds, like in 2019, that I became much more widely known. And I think that that was entirely fair. I think I have I have been a kind of person that's a writer who's always trying to push myself and grow and develop and experiment and learn. And we could talk about that later.
We certainly can. And I'm going to say that slowly because you didn't. That's Reckless Paper Birds. You kind of swallowed the title, but that's your third one, isn't it? So yeah. So, well, I just want to go back to that night at the South Bank because, it's your first book, but it won the Polari First Book Prize, of which I was a judge. So that's how we met. And I remember there was another poetry book on the shortlist as well, Max Wallace's debut. I mean, it's terribly hard to judge, and you have 6. Polari especially because it's first book, it's poetry, memoir, fiction, everything. But yeah, we were absolutely delighted to give you the prize for Frost Fairs. And I think it is this, thinking back, it is this historical sense, of voices coming out of the past that really inspired us and impressed us. And do you remember, I think you were given one of those gigantic comedy checks.
I still have it. I still have it in a wardrobe. I have, yes. I went home carrying this enormous comedy check, and it was a bit like a slapstick film. I was like swinging around on the tube like a ladder, kind of like smacking into people. And yeah, it was a fun night. I wasn't expecting at all to win. I didn't know beforehand. I think Paul had tried to get hold of me, but without success. And so it was a total shock to me, when it was announced.
Yeah, I think it's better if you don't know. And he was probably trying to get in touch. I mean, I've been involved in a fair few prizes, and you want the winner to be there. It's always a bit deflating if they say, and to accept the prize on behalf of, here's the agent. You know, you want the person. So if you're organising, you really want to kind of hint strongly that they should be there without actually letting them know that they've won. So this is Paul Burston, founder of the prize. He was probably sort of trying to make sure that you'd be there. But yeah, I remember you were wandering, last seen staggering off into the night carrying this huge check. So I will always remember that. And very worthy winner. And also, when you're involved in any kind of debut prize, you really want the person to go on to greater and greater things. You know, you're sort of making a pledge for the future, I think, when you're judging a prize like that. So you have indeed been extremely prolific. Poets are not necessarily known for being very prolific, aren't they? You know, sometimes it's a collection every 5 years or decade, but Spacecraft was the next one, I believe. Was that Spacecraft came in 2016, so that was a few years later after the thrilling success of Frost Fairs. So tell me a little bit about how you developed. It seemed to me that the form developed a little bit in Spacecraft, and there's more playing about with form and more inventing your own forms, new forms.
That's right. I was really interested in the white silence of the page with that book. It's called Spacecraft, not because it features spaceships, but because it's a book about absence and emptiness as creative forces in the world that make things happen, the ways in which grief can restructure the way people perceive things. And so that's embodied at a visual level by a lot of shaping of structures on the page. So whereas my first collection had mostly kind of couplets and tercets and quite, neat little boxes, that book is a bit more playful with the visual side of things, and it's more personal too. My first book was quite unusual for a debut, I think, and it didn't have very much autobiographical content, and I suppose partly because I found it a release to, I think because I grew up quite repressed. I think I came out quite late, and I wasn't really ready. I think with my first book, and I just really get excited and energized by the world and history and other people's stories, and so I didn't really do very much autobiographical stuff in my first book. But then in the second one, there is a bit more along those lines. Especially there's one sequence of 10 poems about the death of my first partner from major illness many years ago, and that's what made me want to write a book that was focused on the idea of grief and absence, and how they reshape the world.
I mean, I have to hope that having such ringing endorsements for the first book and indeed winning quite an important prize did sort of help you, maybe help you with your voice, or develop, or be bold, forget the boys on the bus.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to say that, winning the Polari First Book Prize was amazing for me because at the time, the UK poetry world was still very much not promoting anyone that was LGBT openly in their poetry. It was very compared to America, where they'd had such a rich history from Whitman onwards with Frank O'Hara, Allen Ginsberg, Adrienne Rich, Marilyn Hacker, Audre Lorde. Across the 20th century in America, there's all these kind of wonderful gay and lesbian poets. And we'd had so few over here, and it was still really hard to get poems about queer history published in any kind of poetry magazine. Like when I went to university in the 90s, in 1998, my tutor gave me this list of instructions from the Poetry Society at the time, guidelines for sending out to magazines, and they explicitly said, do not send out work that does not have universal appeal, e.g. gay and lesbian poetry. That was literally on their guidelines as a phrase. Like, I handed it to Gregory Woods, who wrote an article about it and related things in Magma a few years ago. But that's something that I was literally being told not to do if you want to get your poetry out there. And so, yeah, it was the fact that there was, I mean, things have changed so much in the last 10 years. The publishing landscape has completely changed for queer writers in the UK, I think. But at the time in 2011, 2012, yeah, it hadn't. And so I was really grateful that Polari, brought me attention and lots more readers than otherwise that book would have had, I think.
I talking about that universality theme, I can just imagine them also thinking that women's voices are not universal enough. You know, that.
Oh, absolutely. This is the whole problem with the discourse of universality, is that it's always implicitly white and male, middle class, heterosexual, all these things. Because otherwise, yeah, and it's just, yeah. Anyway, I won't rant, but yeah, that is something that's always slightly frustrated me. But I think it is something which has been tackled more broadly, by publishing in the last 10 years.
I mean, I've got very old collections of poetry magazines, and the amount of times where, you know, special issue, and it'll focus on 6 men, and it will be 6 white men, you know, pretty much all of whom went to Oxbridge. It
is really weird looking back. Like you know, in the 20th century, you get anthologies that are entirely male or have just like 1 or 2 women in, and like, you know, beside 30 men or whatever. And it's just kind of like really stark now. But even anthologies of poetry that were published here in the 90s and 2000s, they've all aged quite badly because they're overwhelmingly white and heterosexual. Almost all the poets are Oxbridge graduates. And as I say, yeah, I'm quite fortunate in a way that the publishing world has changed in the way that it has, and it has meant that it's possible for writers like me to have a kind of readership that would have been very difficult, I think. Well, I would have written differently, I think, if I'd, you know, been a few decades earlier.
Well, I definitely think that's why Paul set up his prizes. And the first prize he set up was a first book prize for absolutely that reason, to get people on the ladder. I'm just having a little look at which book you had a poem to Frank O'Hara, but that might have been in Frost.
That was in the first book, I think. Yeah,
reading Frank O'Hara on the Brighton Express. I guess he must have been one of your kind of poetic godfathers in a way.
Oh, he really is. I think that with the paucity of examples in the UK, that are like a lot of young queer poets, I had to look to America, really. And the energy and enthusiasm and openness of his poetry I found really invigorating. And also the fact that he was very much comfortable with writing about urban environments. Like all the poetry I'd read before Frank O'Hara pretty much was focused on landscapes and on animals and plants. Nothing wrong with that, but I've always lived in cities, and so the idea that you could write about city life and write about queer subject matter and have this kind of excitement and enthusiasm, all the exclamation marks in Frank O'Hara just mean that his little book Lunch Poems is one of those books that I go back to whenever I'm feeling low, because it re-energizes me. Yeah, he's a really big influence for me, Frank.
Would you be able to read something from Spacecraft?
Yeah,
because I know you don't even have a copy of Frostfires.
The Return of the Repressed. I think a lot of poets like that with their first books. It's just so long ago, and I was still figuring out my way in the world, really.
Yeah.
I'm going to read one of the poems from Spacecraft that's from the sequence I mentioned, which is about the loss of my first partner. It's called "I've Carried a Door on My Back for 10 years. You lugged it from the builder's yard. Now it's my turn to know its stiff weight, the slow chafe of pine against vertebrae, a decade-long kiss flush with splinters. I closed it when I left. The lock snicked. Then I noticed it hitching a ride. It never gives up. Patchy blue, invisible straps, a faint knocking, though nobody's there. So many slab hazards, repeated thumps to my skull, brass hinges clouting strangers as we creep into lifts, beds. I lie awake on its panels, framing rectangular thoughts, obsessed by the side I can't see. What grows there? The problem is, you died, so there's no way to set the thing down. No wall to prop it against, with its stuck handle and fracturing paint. All day, we continue our back-to-front tango. This dance where I almost, but never arrive. Where I'm shut off to visitors for hours. Then, with one touch, swing wildly open.
You mentioned page poetry and slam poetry, but it's always seemed to me that you read your poetry very brilliantly and engagingly. You know, it's not a kind of monotone like I've heard some people read. Did you start sort of going to open mic things, reading your work from fairly early on?
I did, yeah. So when I went to UEA in the 90s, that's when I first started performing my poems, and I was abysmal. I went far too fast. I mean, as is evident, my natural speaking voice is quite fast. I get very excited. I'm a very enthusiastic soul, which is fine in conversations with friends who know me well. But with a poem, you do need to let the audience hear each word. It really helps. And because I was so nervous, with my first few readings, I just rattled through, and I don't think anyone could really understand half of what I was saying. And it took me, it's like any craft, any art, performance is a separate skill from writing, and it's something that I've had to work at, the same as I've had to work at becoming better as a writer and honing my craft. I've had to do that with performance skills as well, so it didn't come naturally to me at all. I'm quite introverted and not a natural for being on the stage, but because I wanted people to read my poems, performing them really is the best way of connecting with new people, in terms of you can connect with this great big number of them at once. And I've enjoyed trying to grow and develop as a performer over the years as much as I've enjoyed trying to transform my writing.
And when you're writing a poem like that, you're writing these elegies that form the centerpiece of the book. How long does it take to sort of process the emotion before you can start to write about it?
A long time, yeah. One of the things I find, I think especially with elegies, but also in general, I find that I can't write about traumatic experiences until quite a long time has passed. So usually I have to it's usually many years after the events in the poem that I'm reflecting and able to ask questions and investigate my feelings. I think often for me a poem is an exploration, a probing, an investigation. I don't sit down intentionally to say something in particular. I'm much more likely to begin with an image or something, you know, a corner of something, and then the writing process is the unfolding of that, and you know, and a poem crystallizes, I hope, as a result.
Do you lay things aside and come back to them, or is it pretty much, you know, a set process, go in, write it, and out at the end?
I always end up setting things aside, and there are poems in every book that that were begun many years before, and just hung around with various missing limbs or entrails or feet or no head or what have you. And I have islands of text that float around in notebooks. I have half-finished poems on my computer. I am always going back, and sometimes individual images get extracted from a failed poem and I use them in a new context, or I'm very much a recycler like that. I like to, if I'm particularly pleased with an image or something, that's quite a common thing for me to do, is to pick it up again months or years later and see if I can find the, obviously it's just about the right angle of approach. But yeah, it's not at all unusual for me to only come upon the right ending for a poem sometime later, much many months after the first draft.
I'm not going to remember the exact quote, but there is a wonderful thing that Ted Hughes actually said about when he was editing Sylvia Plath's poems, and he obviously saw her at work and they discussed their work, and he said, well, one thing was that she worked very hard. She was always working on something, but it said if she set out to make a table and it wasn't a table, it was a chair, that was okay. And if it wasn't a chair, it was a toy. And I think that is just a wonderful way to look at it, and clearly that quote as well. But
just and I found that inspiration when I first came across it, because because it does take a longer time for poetry to crystallize, one of my favorite words. I think that I don't want to waste good bits if I can help it, so I will very rarely bin the whole of a poem and never go back to any of it. Sometimes it's just that it takes a few bites of the cherry before I hit on the right way in. So often it's a question of perspective, and as I said, finding the best angle of approach, finding a way in that's surprising and engaging and arresting, one that's got energy and momentum. And so it's not at all unusual, especially if I'm interested in a subject, it's a new subject for me, or a new form, then the first crack will usually be fairly poor, but it's necessary, to make lots of mistakes in order to, to achieve something that's more sculpted and polished. You can't just begin at that level. You have to, be steps along the way.
Let's move on to the next collection, because you speeded up a bit. You speeded up your production.
I did,
Reckless Paper Birds, coming out in 2019. So again, how did this move on from Spacecraft?
This was an odd thing in that something just came loose in me when I'd finished Spacecraft. Though I'd begun writing in 1996, I'd only produced 2 books by 2016, which isn't that many really. And then, I definitely hugely increased my productivity after Spacecraft. And it was just, I don't know if it was, I'm sure there's some kind of psychoanalytical thing about processing grief or something, but I don't know. I just kind of, I changed everything about my practice and the way that I wrote poems. I really wanted to write, because Spacecraft, all of my books are reactions in some sense to the one before. They're a departure from whatever I was doing before. I almost always begin by, okay, I've done that. What am I going to do next? That's not that, what am I going to do now? And so, because I've done a book of very slow poems with lots of white space on the page, lots of elegies, lots of reflections on grief and absence and emptiness, I wanted to do a book that was very energetic, that was very full of momentum, that was very much focused on the body. I wanted to do a book that was all about the vulnerability of the body, but I wanted it to be a very passionate book. And I wanted it to be a kind of best friend book to me as I say, Lunch Poems by Frank O'Hara was a best friend book, still is, that I can go to when I'm feeling down. I wanted to write a book about queer joy, because almost all of the books that had won prizes about queer life, especially for queer men, were books, about AIDS, like Tom Gunn, The Man with Night Sweats, the Nick Drake collection, Man in the White Suit, Mark Doty's My Alexandria. It seemed like, you had to do that in order to get anywhere as a queer male writer. And I really wanted to, I was in a relationship by that point, and I was very happy. And I really wanted to do a book that was just joyful and different to all of the, not obviously there's much to be said for elegies and for sad poems, but I hadn't read very many poems in the UK that expressed queer joy, and so that was a big part of Rex Paper Birds too.
Well, judging the different Polari prizes, I would concur. I think the sort of tragic voices kind of overshadow the joyful voices, and maybe that will change as sort of maybe life gets a little bit easier. I noticed you use the Q word a lot, and some people don't like that, but you clearly do. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
Is that because it's a bit wider and freer than the L, the G, and so on?
I suppose, for me, I like the way that it captures aspects of sexuality and gender that are more complex and ambiguous and fluid. It's a word that I like because it almost kind of it's open to, new possibilities, new structures. And I find it captures more of me than the word gay. I mean, I've been in a relationship with a man for a long time, 20 years. And I don't mind being, I often, people still use that word about me, and that's fine. But I feel that queer captures more of who I am. I mean, I totally understand. I mean, I've been called on the street, as some of the poems explore. I've had the Q word shouted at me on the street, and I know that a lot of the opposition to it is to the fact that it comes from a painful place. But even a word like gay, I think for young people today, for them growing up, they're more likely to have been called gay as an insult at school. And so it is really difficult. It is, difficult territory. And I wouldn't ever want to tell other people what words they should use. I think we all, just have to make our own choices as to what best fits us.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you like to read a nice, friendly poem, or
I would,
whatever you like from Reckless Paper?
No, well, I would like to read, one of my very manic love poems from this book. And I think this book, for me, I really feel like I found, it was a kind of a breakthrough for me in many different ways, but I really was able to dive more into me. So whereas I'd only begun to do autobiographical stuff with Spacecraft, with this book there are loads of very enthusiastic love poems, and there's more of a sense of what I'm really like, which is more chaotic. I think if you know me day to day, I think there is much more of me in Rex Paper Birds than there was in the first two books, which are more detached and sculpted and careful, and elegies and quite slow paced. Whereas this book is a bit of a sugar rush at times, and that's more reflective of who I am, I think. So anyway, I'm going to read one of the manic love poems in it, which is called Stationary.
Right.
September is going all out to ease us in. The clouded sky is a whiteboard for helpful diagrams. The first cool air as welcome as your hand inside my jeans. Autumn zips round with its orange highlighter, and you provide nifty shocks and marshmallows, leaving pornographic post-its that ask me to rendezvous, please, for hot chocolate. I am the type of man who likes unnecessary displays of manners, who appreciates thank you cards, warning signs, a forest of regretful notices for building works. I admire rows of ginkgos lose all their foliage in one drop to form a yellow brick road. I am a desperate lion today, Stalking scarecrow. I chew biros, glimpse at my watch too often. I was so afraid of being late to see you once. I turned up 6 days early. Love is horrific like that. First it's a rabbit, then a duck, then it's a ravenous one-eyed sock puppet. But the rest is yogurt adverts. And you fasten my thoughts with the most beautiful paper clips, even the filthy ones, like the time I saw a grove of ripening chili plants become a rainbow of penis trees. Do you wish to continue? Says the voice of a self-service checkout. Yes, yes I do. Between the shops, the sea snuggles under its blue leaves. The clock tower waits patiently for Christmas. A familiar figure below it, waggling his arms to lure me over. Succeeding. Your skillful face punches a giant hole in the day. And I jump through it.
Fantastic. Is that I mean, I can really see the kind of rollicking rhythms and the fun that you had with that. Are they faster to write in any way, or are you still kind of, plodding along word by word?
I used a lot of free writing with that book, and my editing was really different. My idol as a writer growing up had always been Elizabeth Bishop, who would often spend, years on a single poem, kind of honing and perfecting. And with Rex Per Birds, the whole book was written fairly quickly, and a lot of it involved free writing. Because a lot of the poems are quite manic and breakneck speed, and excited. A lot of the poems are. The speaker is quite excited. And so, I did use completely different techniques and structures with that book to my previous two. And I like doing that. I think as a writer, what keeps me interested, and the reason that I am more prolific is I focus very much on what haven't I done yet and what haven't I read yet. I'm, I suppose like most good writers, as if I am a good writer, like most writers, I'm always trying to read things. I'm always trying to read things I haven't done. I'm always trying to develop and grow and mature. And I want to do things that I haven't done before. And that definitely, was what I was doing with Rex Paper Birds. And I wrote the whole thing, as I say, fairly quickly.
Is that technique where you just more or less let the hand write, you're in a cafe or on a bus or something, and you're just tapping into that stream of consciousness? And it's usually afterwards just that I comb through and I extract, maybe a few images or whatever. I don't use the whole of it. I do still do sculpting and honing and editing. But I find it a really useful technique. So that poem Stationery was begun as a free write outside the cafe where I'd met my partner in 2003, Red Roaster on St James Street in Brighton. So I went back there in September and I was scribbling away about what I could see, because it was autumn when I was writing the poem. It was September. And I quite like using observations. Like a lot of my poems have a lot of concrete detail from city streets, and I like having variation and contrast, I think, in my poems, and observation is very handy for in that sense, I think. That sounds a little bit psychogeographic in a way, sort of going back somewhere and steeping yourself all over again in what's around. Are you a poet of place?
Oh, I haven't really thought about that. I think I am in a way, in that certainly I'm always telling my students to go to the source with their notebook. Like if you want to write about something in a fresh way, then take your notebook away from your desk. And, if you're writing about a particular tree, go to the tree. If you're writing about, fish, go to the aquarium, whatever, and write about what, you really do notice in the moment, rather than what you dream up at your desk, which will always be slightly at one remove and slightly more, it'll be through a more cerebral lens rather than something more immediate. I think that I am a writer of place, and that I often do quite a lot of writing outside my home, and I like surprises. I like being energized by the outside world, and I like it when things happen unexpectedly in my writing. And one thing that enables that is if I'm writing somewhere like a cafe or, an aquarium or what have you, and I will take my notebook and write anyway. My partner finds this slightly amusing. I will often take my notebook, and there have been times when I've stood under railway bridges. I've gone out at 2 a.m. or whatever with my notebook because I want something very particular that's authentic. Or, I want to be writing in response to things that are really there. Just 'cause I think it helps to make the writing feel more alive. And for me, energy is one of my favorite words. I want my poems to fizz and crackle, and that helps that, I think.
Did reading them aloud and doing events also help sort of free up your writing away? Because, whenever you read something with a crowd, there'll be, they like that line, or they laughed at that bit really hit home. I mean, it must change how you think about your writing in a way.
Definitely. One of the ways in which I have evolved over the years is definitely in response to readers and to audiences. And one of the main ways of promoting a poetry book is doing a book tour and going to lots of, theatres and bookshops and other places where readings happen. And I do notice which ones really land. Now, it's not that all of them are designed for that context. There are some things, if I'm doing something visually with layout on the page, that's going to be harder to replicate in performance. But it's definitely shaped how I write. And it's made me be, I think, more immediate, more kind of keen to be clear-eyed. And I like having things, I like the poem to have impact on the first read, to make you want to go back to it. So I don't want don't want the poem to be so subtle that kind of people get to the end and they're just confused. I like that you have to give quite a lot to the reader on that first time through, but then pack in little surprises and things that they might notice when they reread.
And did this one win a prize as well? I mean, you've won other prizes, haven't you?
Yeah, this one won it was shortlisted for the Costa, and it was the winner of the Hawthornden Prize for Literature in 2020, which was amazing, which was just so bizarre because the thing about the Hawthornden Prize is that they don't tell you that you're on the shortlist. So the first I knew that about it was when I'd already won it, apparently. And I was at home doing the washing up one night, and I had this phone call from I don't know what his name is, from a lord, somebody who's associated with the prize.
It's quite a posh one, isn't it? Yeah,
it's a very I think it's the oldest prize in the UK. Is won by the great and the good, Graham Greene and people. But he rang me up and he just said, you've won this prize, the Hawthornden, this year's Hawthornden Prize for Literature, and it's £15,000. I didn't know because the publishers can't enter it even. Literally, the judges assemble books based on other prize shortlists and things that they've come across, and they whittle down the books till there is one winner. And so my publisher hadn't sent them anything, and so it's the first he'd heard of it as well. So he said, yes, well done. And by the way, I like the one about the musical penis. There is a poem in the book literally with a musical penis. But it was a surreal experience because I was really pleased just to be shortlisted for the Costa. Was wonderful in terms of bookshop presence, I think, because it was associated with fiction as well. I think the Costa actually made a really big difference to poets if you're on the shortlist in terms of alerting people who didn't normally read poetry to your work. So I was really pleased with that. And as I say, I had no clue whatsoever about the Hawthornden until someone phoned me up and said that I'd won it, which was, quite a surprise.
Wow. And I think this is the one where I was at the Hastings Literary Festival, and I think you were reading from it, or you did an event there, because we definitely met down in Hastings and had a good time. Yeah, excellent little festival. So we will go on to your latest, Panic Response. And again, I grabbed this one. I think it was another Polari. It was the Polari prizes, wasn't it? And you did a reading, and you were one of the judges for the debut. But anyway, I didn't realise you had yet another book out, and I rushed off and bought it. So most of these copies are signed copies. This one certainly is. Yes, yeah. So. The very latest, I should say, all of these, the first one is published by Salt. These are published rather beautifully by Penned in the Margins, which, alas, is not publishing anymore. I mean, it's not, they haven't dropped you. They're not not publishing any more poetry, are they, at the moment? So
that's right. Yeah, definite hiatus.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Panic Response, because this has a poem into a teacher of yours, a former teacher.
Yeah, I'll read that one shortly, I think. That's an example of another poem of mine that engages with a traumatic event that I couldn't write about until many, many years later. In that case, I think about 20 years later or so, before I could write about what happened. And this book is more dark than my first three. As I say, all of the books are a response to the one before in a way. And whereas Rex Pepper Birds was more kind of fizzy and kind of rushing around, Panic Response is a more experimental book, a more dark book that engages a lot with anxiety, cultural anxiety, things like mental health issues, things like that. And I had a wonderful science teacher. One of the reasons that I got into using so much imagery from chemistry and biology and physics is because of at my A-levels, I did, as well as English, I did biology and chemistry. And I had this wonderful teacher called Mrs. Brown, who got me enthused about science. And was and she always did these brilliant, as the poem says later, did these amazing impressions of excited electrons, like zipping around the room. She'd put her arms out and she'd, dash around the circumference of the room, and to make her point about the what happens when an electron goes from one shell to another, what happened to her was truly terrible, and I couldn't write about it for a long time. And then one day, literally, this newspaper cutting that I had about her, I kept from 20 years before. It kind of like drifted down from a cupboard when I think my partner found it. It was just floating. I just remember it just floated through the air. It was on the carpet, and he picked it up. And and it was this article about her, and it felt like I was able to perhaps address it. And also because it's an experimental book, like some of the lines on the page are crossed out with that poem. And this idea that you could have something present on the page but rejected, scored through, was very important. I should say that, the poem engages with domestic violence, and there is a sentence that describes an act which is very brutal, and I wanted to write the poem because I didn't want her to be defined by that. Anyone that's interested in physics or chemistry will know about quantum theory and the idea, and the way that scientists now view particles and the subatomic, which is very magical and in defiance of Newtonian laws of physics. All kinds of things go on down there in terms of particles disappearing from one place, appearing somewhere else, being in two different states at once. That imagery I found I've always found quantum physics really exciting. And it felt right to use that as a way of, and her own impression of an electron. Anyway, should I read the poem? Because I've been talking quite a lot about it.
Read the poem. Yeah.
So when I hold my finger up, it's because the line in the poem is crossed out. There's a little section of text where it's all crossed out on the page. Quantum, in memory of Avril Brown, 1951 to 2002. Now and then, the past flutters out of a cupboard. I cradle a yellowed newspaper cutting. Mrs. Brown, my chemistry teacher, found dead. Her husband stabbed her 47 times with a screwdriver. He barely spoke a civil word to her, said the prosecutor, once he lost his job after a stroke, while she became head of department. This needs correcting. Avril was a lilac potassium flame. She talked to phosphorus, encouraged it to turn hexagonal. Her clan, gauze, tongs, crucible. She never gave up on experiments, including the boy who kept smashing conical flasks, whose thermometers rolled off desks to their doom. Oh, for goodness sake, here, try again. In the picture that comes when I hear her name, she is tilting, arms spread, as she tears round the lab, aping an excited electron, how it radiates vigor, shapes light. You cannot kill an electron. It has no substructure. Avril, in this image, is both particle and wave, past and future, her grin wide as she accelerates, decade after decade.
That is a truly brilliant poem. Would you say that you're kind of skilling up as you go on? Are you finding things easier as you write?
In a way, I mean, I think one of the things is that I can only write if I'm doing something that feels like it's new and exciting for me. So in a sense, I just I just get bored with myself if I'm doing something that I've already done before. And so as soon as I've learned one skill, it's like, okay, now it's now time to, get uncomfortable again, start making mistakes again. And, whilst I try to learn some new ones. So I'm working on, the next book. And again, it's a departure from panic response, as all my books have been. But I think they have to be. One of the things that's really helped my development is that I'm a tutor as well. I have returning students as a creative writing tutor. One of the things with returning students is that you can't just you don't want to give them the same syllabus again. And so I've got this course that I've been running now for about 10 years or so. And every summer I cast my net far and wide so that I can teach on a completely new set of poets each year. So I can give them completely different examples of everything. And I'm most enthusiastic and passionate as a tutor when I am teaching on work that I've never taught on before. So I just love feeding into my brain loads of books that I'm unfamiliar with. And one of the best things about the Hawthornden Prize, because it was so much money, I spent almost all of it on books. I literally did. I ordered from America loads and loads of poetry books that hadn't been published over here and that I wouldn't have otherwise had access to. So I thought I'd just feed it back into my process. And and I always have to do that. I think one of the reasons why I am quite prolific is that I'm always trying to feed new things in rather than trying to repeat things that I've done before.
So the next collection will have to find a new home. Has it found one yet?
Oh well, we'll see. Yes. I can't say too much about it at the moment.
Okay. We were both at a poetry launch a couple of weeks ago, and we were having an interesting discussion with another poet who said that poets speak to each other or write to each other, that you're sort of aware of what's going on around at the moment. I mean, and I was surprised by that, maybe because perhaps I have a capital R romantic view that poets are sort of, actually, even the romantics kind of read each other, didn't they, and discussed each other's work. So is reading contemporary work really an important part of the process?
Oh, definitely. And reading work from lots of different countries. So as well as America, I love reading work in translation. I love reading, Australian poets, Canadian poets. The more you read, the more it helps you to not be dominated by one voice as well. I think that if you just have a small circle that you constantly go back to, then I think it's almost inevitable that you will dry up, or you will start sounding more and more like them. Whereas if you cast your net widely, then I think it makes it much easier to keep entering new territory and kind of expanding the voice, growing, trying out new voices. I think that I quite like the idea of having multiple voices, that Whitman thing, containing multitudes and all that. There's much to be said for that.
Yeah. Can we talk about a poet that I know you very much admire, and that is this lady, Rosemary Tonks. It would be very hard to sound like Rosemary Tonks, I think, but she's both an extraordinary poet, and the story behind her writing is extraordinary as well. So how did you come across the great Miss Tonks?
Well, I first read her in anthologies. There's, as you say, there's quite a unusual backstory in terms of her turning away from poetry and people not being able to get hold of her early work. Someone actually gave me the Iliad of Broken Sentences before it was republished by Blood Axe as part of that collection there. And that second collection of hers in particular, I just found wonderful. I think partly it's because I really connect with her manic quality. She's quite manic as well. She is charging about. There's always interruptions, sudden interruptions when she, realizes something, and very creative with imagery. I've always, as I say, I've always been drawn to imagery and phrase making that is particularly creative, that is compelling because it, pushes the boundaries and trying to do things that that aren't very familiar to the reader. And I came across her, I think it was after the Philosophers, but before Spacecraft, first of all. I came across the Iliad of Broken Sentences, and I just find she's probably one of my favorite British poets, definitely one of the writers that I've taught on the most. And she's fab.
She kind of interrupts herself. She goes on a train of thought and then kind of breaks in on her own thoughts with something else. And there is this really engaging kind of crossness about her. She's cross with the world and quite cross at herself. And it's wonderfully comical. And she was very successful. I mean, she was heading off for a good career, and then, like you say, something happened in her life and she gave up on poetry entirely. And I think she could have, well, I want to say could have been one of the greats. I think in a way she is one of the greats. She's just such a distinctive voice. She did 2 collections, and Sylvia Plath only did 2 collections as well, one posthumous. So it's all here in this rather wonderful collection, and she uses a lot of exclamation marks as well, doesn't she? She loves an exclamation mark.
A lot of cabbages. As a thinker, as a professional water cabbage.
There's words and phrases she uses in her own unique way.
Quite similar to Plath in that way. She has her own personal mythology. She has particular images that she goes back and back to, that she's kind of obsessed by.
Do you set writing exercises as a poetry tutor?
I do, I set I always come up with a new fleet of them each year, usually in response to whatever poets I've set them to read. So the reading for me is always really central, just because I'm trying to, I suppose, convey what's been most helpful to me in terms of my artistic growth and development. So my students always have to do quite a bit of reading, but we do writing exercises that are informed by the reading.
Give us one example.
Oh my word! Oh gosh!
I do like the idea of going out at 2 a.m. with a notebook.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's
Stay
always at least
safe,
one
people.
exercise.
Stay safe. But
Yeah, often in my exercise, they have to go off somewhere near wherever we're teaching, if it's in person. So one that I did quite recently involved disjunction and non sequiturs, and they had to. What do they have to do? You put me on the spot here. They had to write down a list of nouns down one side of the page. Then they had to go through, and this is quite a Freudian exercise in dissociation, and they had to try to write a word next to each of the nouns that had that didn't have a very obvious and immediate connection to the word on the left. So, try to write a word that's as far away as you can. And of course, the human mind, we're hunter-gatherers. We're designed to find connections between things, to find trails, to follow clues and things. So it is actually really hard for the human brain to come up with something that's completely unrelated. And one of the things that I asked them to do with those 2 columns of words was to think about all the images that those unusual pairs suggested. So these words that you wouldn't normally find in the same sentences. So it might be, you've got violin and you've got rhubarb next to it, and the images of someone, playing the violin using a stalk of rhubarb as a bow or something. And so I asked them to think of all the images that were suggested by the pairs, and then write an image-based poem which has one of your pairs at the center in the form of an image, and see if you can use it not just for humor, but as see if you can. What did I say? Something about if you can think about it, whether it might be a metaphor for a relationship or a type of relationship, or a metaphor for society or a group of people in society, or a practice like singing or teaching, or a concept like love or death or what have you. But yeah, that's off the top of my head. That's the first one that
Wow. To be in one of your classes, it sounds like a lot of fun.
I love
and hard
teaching.
work.
It's very much like performing poetry, I think. My teaching is quite energetic and enthusiastic. I really enjoy. I always wanted to be a teacher as much as to be a writer, I think, and I really like trying to think about what would be the most helpful. How can I, spur growth and development? And I'm a people person. I think I'm not a stereotypical writer in that sense, even though I can be introverted, but certainly when it comes to the classroom, I absolutely love trying to connect with people, and in order to best meet their needs. That sounds like I'm filling in some sort of form.
Oh no! I think it's achieve learning outcomes.
Oh God!
I think you'll find with best practices. Okay. Well, we'll leave the jargon aside for the moment. I am going to wrap up and ask you my final 3 questions that I ask everybody. So moving away from words, let's find out what your favourite artwork is. Do you have one?
Well, I did think about this. I suppose I would probably have to go for a Hockney. So I particularly like Nichols Canyon. I think it's acrylic on canvas, is it? But there's also a really lovely watercolour sketch he did for it, which has this kind of like sinuous in the acrylic. The road down the centre is this black snake. Down this, it's such as described for people. It's landscapes of Los Angeles, very colourful, painting of this winding road going through.
This is sort of the 70s period, roughly, isn't it? When he was based over
there. That's right. He was based in California, and I think this painting's about 1980 or so. But there's a little sketch he did for it that I also love, and I've always had to think about that wanted to sound too pretentious. I'm quite sensitive to colour. I've always been quite synesthetic in my work. I often use quite a lot of colour, and I've always been particularly drawn to orange and yellow. So a lot of my favourite paintings, whether they're Hockney or Picasso or whoever, they're often featuring orange or yellow.
So that sings to you in a way.
It does, yeah. I mean, I love all kinds of Hockney paintings. I also like his earlier work too. I like his really kind of political earlier stuff. Like, I love. Do you know is it called Cleaning Teeth or Teeth Cleaning Teeth? It's these two blobby men, and their cocks have been turned into tubes of Colgate toothpaste, and they're squirting it into each other's mouths in a 69 type situation. Completely.
Wow.
This is not the kind of stuff that you would associate with later Hockney at all, but I really like that kind of the rawness of his early pre-swimming pool stuff as well. But yeah, those are some. I love Picasso as well. And was I thinking? When I knew that you were going to ask this question, there's another. I've mentioned Bishop before, and there's a beautiful painting by her friend Lauren McIver, who is the first woman represented in the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection. There's a wonderful 1939 painting by McIver of, I think it's Elizabeth Bishop's house, and it's watercolours and ink on paper, and it's very similar to Nichols Canyon in terms of being very dynamic in its use of lots of colour.
Okay, that's at least 3. So we'll let you have that. You've obviously read a huge amount in poetry. I wonder if there's a book that you should have read by now that you feel a bit guilty about, and if so, what would that be? Or is there an area that you are surprisingly ill-read in? Confess all.
I think it would probably be Ulysses. I've never actually read Ulysses. I've just noticed that I need to plug in my computer to prevent the power going off. So I'm just going to quickly move around, so you can see my cat actually as I move. Oh, can you see them down here?
Your cat? Oh, we have to have a cat in the book bag. That is brilliant.
They are
made my day.
They are named Nan and Flo after the characters. Oh, I've gone. There I am. After the characters in Sarah Waters' Tipping the Velvet. So.
Oh, how lovely.
Yes.
Andrew McMillan, I think, has a nice dog. I've seen that via Zoom. Poets' Pets. We could have a whole series on Poets' Pets. Well, it's funny you mention Ulysses, because a lot of people have guilt around Ulysses. It is one of those things that people think that they should have read and they haven't read. So you are not alone. And finally, what's the weirdest, funniest feedback you've ever had about any aspect of your work?
Well,
maybe a review
after the Frosters, one of the lovely things was that I did get to meet more writers. I'd always been, I think because I come from the background I do, I had not really met very many writers who have been a part of the literary world. But that changed as time went on, and I came to know one poet in particular. I shall leave him nameless at the moment, but an American poet, and I sent him this long poem that appears in Spacecraft. I think it's called The Willful Eye, and one of the I was working on it for ages, because it was it's longer than anything I'd done before. And I asked him for his feedback, so I sent him a copy, and he said that he really liked it, but he was wondering if the ending was a leap too far. And when I looked on it, I'd left on this undeleted instruction to myself at the end saying, sort out this fucking awful ending. And that's what he was responding to. He thought that was the last bit of the poem. But that always amuses me.
Well, I mean, poetry is a bit like modern art. If you leave a bucket full of cleaning materials in an art gallery, pretty soon people will gather around going, interesting. So, putting something like, must remember to send this to Rialto pronto could be seen as a last line. So. Okay, that's not too bad as feedback though. Did you fess up? Did you say
I don't know if I did. I think I might have just been too embarrassed, I think. It was, yeah. But then I am generally quite clumsy like that, and quite, yes. There's another poem in Palette Response called Oops, I Did It Again, which is about kind of the greatest hits of my incompetence, because I am rather prone to such things.
Well, we'll leave it there, but it's been fantastic having you in the book bag, and best of luck with everything, and let's see your new collection soon.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Somebody please publish John McCullough, because he's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in real life soon, I hope.
Hope so.
Cheers. Bye-bye. And thank you very much for joining me. Now you know what to do. Go out at 2 a.m. with a notebook, or write lists of words to yourself that don't have any connection. I think all of that would be a very fun thing to do. And don't forget to join me next time with the next person, the next victim in the book bag. Who will that be? Wait and see. Thank you. Goodbye.